In this video, which is the 14th in my series on how to make a 3D space shooter game in Unity, I add some UI elements to show how many missiles we have left in our launcher, and how many reloads we have available, and a reload progress bar. I also added a capacitor to our blasters with a limited amount of energy and a recharge time. We added visual indicators to show how much capacitor is left in the blaster and how much is recharging over time. So grab your favorite beverage, pull up a chair, and follow along as I teach you how to write a 3D space shooter in Unity. In our last video, we added seeking missiles, so we're now able to lock on to our enemy ships and launch missiles at them. And the missiles lock on and chase them. Boom. Okay, so we gave each missile launcher, and I also realized I made a mistake last week and I put the missile launchers on the blasters. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy component, and then I'm going to remove this component, and I'll remove it from both blasters. And then I will select both of our missile launchers. I will say add component, missile launcher, and then I will paste component values to get all those values back. So each launcher gets 4 missiles and has 2 reloads with a reload time of 10 seconds currently. I think it would be nice to display that information in the UI so the user can see how many missiles they have left, and then when they're reloading, how long before the reload's complete, and then how many reloads they have left. And I also see I have some old log messages here in the console. I'm going to go ahead and delete those just to clean up the console a little bit. And so for displaying the items in the UI, we're going to come up here under managers to our UI manager, and we've got this canvas here. And currently the only thing we're displaying in the canvas are our target boxes, our lock-on reticles, and our off-screen indicators for targeting the enemy ships. But we can use this canvas to display other UI elements. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to create a new empty game object, and I'm going to call this MissileUI, and I'm going to put that on the UI layer. And under that, I'm going to create another empty game object, and I'm going to call this Missiles Loadout. And I'm going to give that a vertical layout group. And underneath of that, we're going to create another, I'm going to call it missile ammo group. We're going to create one for each missile launcher. So let's call this missile ammo. And I'm going to add a horizontal layout group to this one. And then the way that's going to work is each of the missile indicators that we display here will be rendered horizontally in this group, and then each of these will be rendered vertically in that group. And I'll duplicate that after we get some things tested out. Now we need an image to display for our missiles, and I actually basically rendered the missile that we're using for our 3D object. I rendered it and then did a screen capture of it, and I created a transparent sprite, and I'm just going to drag that into our sprites folder. So right now all we've got in there is our crosshairs and our health bar, and so we're going to create a new sprite that we're going to call missile. So I'm just going to drag this image that I've got in here, and we need to do a little bit to it. We're going to go up to the texture type and change it to sprite 2D in UI. This is all good. We want to reduce the size, and we want to make sure that alpha is transparent is set to true, and then we will apply. And so now we've got this transparent image here. And if we come up to our missile loadout and go to our rect transform, I'm going to select anchoring that. Actually, I want to anchor it to the lower bottom. And if we come into our missile ammo and we create a UI image, and then we drag in that missile image, you can see it's displaying that. It's not in the right place currently, but we'll fix that. The other thing I want to do is I want to tell it to use native size, and then I'm going to scale it down to 0.2. And we're going to grab the move tool and take this whole missile loadout here, and we're going to drag it to the left, and we're going to drag it down to somewhere over there. Okay. And then if we were to duplicate this a bunch of times, you can see we get 4 of those. And if we were to duplicate these, you see we've got these 2 groups arranged vertically. I want to move this whole thing up some because I want to have room underneath to display some text. So I'm going to create a TextMeshPro UI TextMeshPro. Now we need to import the TextMeshPro essentials. So we'll go ahead and do that. Close this. And then we're going to rename this Reloads Remaining. And this is also going to be anchored to the lower left. I'm going to drag this. And I'm going to have to tweak this some because I'm actually going to change the font. Some things we're going to want to do here. Make that 24 pixels, centered horizontally and vertically, disable wrapping. And I'm going to set this to reloads :2 just for default. And we're going to want to create a new type of font for this. So I actually went and found on this site 1001freefonts.com. I like this Orbitron font. I can't remember what category it was in. Modern. So it's in the modern category. But I think that looks pretty good for sort of a heads-up display kind of thing. And so you can just download that. And when you download it, it downloads into a zip file. And they've got a regular version, medium version, bold version, black version. We're just going to use the regular version. And so if we go into our editor here, we're going to create a folder called fonts. And I'll double click that. And if I right click in here and say show an explorer, it gives me an explorer window, and I'll double click the fonts folder. And then we'll open up our zip file again. And I'm just going to drag this Orbitron regular TDF into that folder. And I'll close these. If we go back into Unity, you can see Unity now sees that as a TTF file. Now, in order to create a TextMeshPro font, we go up to Window, TextMeshPro, Font Asset Creator. And then here, I'd already done this when I was testing, so it's already populated this. But essentially, we would just drag this Orbitron regular into here, generate Font Atlas, and then save as, and we're going to save it with this name, Orbitron-regular SDF asset in our fonts folder. And you can see we now have a TextMeshPro font called Orbitron regular SDF. So if we go back into our reloads remaining text file, under font, we can select that Orbitron regular. And so now, well, it's displaying it in the scene view, but not in the game view. What happens if we click play? None of that is displaying. It's displaying up here. So it's off the screen, actually. Okay, take this, take the move tool, drag that there. It's a little tedious, but once we get it set up, I think it's going to look nice. And hit play. And there we go. So in the lower left hand of our screen, we've got our missiles and a number of reloads. So now we need to actually edit the scripts to update those to reflect the actual number of missiles and the actual number of reloads. And in order to display that information, we need to expose it from the missile launcher itself. So if we go back into our missile launcher script, we're going to have to add a few things. So currently we're giving the number of missiles and reloads and the reload time and cooldown time. All of that is provided through serialized fields so we can set them in the inspector. And then we're initializing some things, and on enable down here, we're going to want to expose some things publicly so that our UI can render it. And I think we're also going to want to have an event that we can fire. Whenever we fire a missile or when the reloads are completed, so our UI can be notified of those changes and only update the display when it needs to, and we're not constantly polling it to display. So for some of the public things we want to expose, we want to have the capacity of our missile launcher. And that's going to be the number of missiles. Oh, and this needs to be equals and greater than, and that's an integer. So we are, with an expression body method, returning the number of missiles. That's our loader capacity. We want to know the actual number of missiles, and that'll be our missiles remaining. We want to know how much our reload time has elapsed if we're reloading. I'm going to call that reload percent. That'll be a float. And we're actually going to subtract that from 1 because we want to kind of go backwards. We're going to be displaying a progress bar for this. So we'll say the reload delay. And we're going to divide that by the reload time. So reload time we specify in the inspector. That's how long it takes to reload. It's currently set to 10 in the inspector. And then the reload delay we set while we're reloading. And so that's how much of the reload time has elapsed. And this is going to give us a percentage, which we'll subtract from 1. And that'll tell us how much of our progress bar to display. And then we also want to keep track of how many reloads we have remaining. That needs to be an integer. And we want a Boolean to say whether or not we're actually reloading. And that will be true if our missiles remaining is less than 1, and our reloads remaining is greater than 0, and our reload delay is greater than 0. And then we'll add our event. We're going to call this missile fired. We're going to have 2 events. We'll have one for missile fired and one for missiles reloaded. And we want to instantiate them. I think a good place to instantiate them will be in awake. So we'll say missile fired equals new Unity event, missiles reloaded equals new Unity event. All that looks good. That looks good. So when we fire a missile, we're also going to want to trigger that event. So we'll say missile fired dot invoke, and same thing when we reload missiles. I think we also want to set our reload delay to 0 so we can fire as soon as our missiles are reloaded. It also makes sure that what we're rendering in the UI is correct. So we fire that event. I think that's all we need to do in the missile launcher. Go back into Unity, and we're going to want to create a UI script to render those UI fields that we added. So under scripts, UI, we'll create a new script, and I'm going to call this MissileUI. Double click to open that up, zoom in, delete this boilerplate. I am going to want to add a TextMeshPro and UnityEngine.UI using statements. So let's add all the serialized fields we're going to need. We're going to want a serialized field for our missile launchers. This will be an array. We're going to want one for those missile ammo transforms in that UI element. So we'll call this an array of transforms missile ammo. We need a prefab for that MissileIndicator, which reminds me, but we didn't actually create a prefab yet. We need to do that. That needs to be a game object. Okay. We're also eventually going to have something that we display when we're reloading. It's going to be sort of a progress bar that says reloading, and that will also be a game object. We haven't created that yet, but I'm just going to go ahead and put this here before I forget. Okay. And that will have a progress bar associated with it, which will be an image, like we did for our health bar. And then we need a TextMeshPro text field for the reloads remaining. Okay, and on enable, we want to iterate through all of our launchers. And we want to subscribe to their events. So there's the missile fired event, add listener. We're going to call this one update missile display. And I'll just go ahead and create that. And we're also going to want to subscribe to the missiles reloaded. And I'm going to say on reload complete. I'm going to complete it, make it past tense. And I'm going to put this one below the other one. All right. Whenever we subscribe to events, it's always a good idea to remove those listeners. So remove listener. And while we're in on enable, let's just go ahead and call update missile display and on reload completed. update missile display. We're going to iterate through our missile ammo's children. So each of these missile ammos is a transform. So it's an array of transforms. See, I is less than. And so each of those transforms is going to have some number of children, which are missile indicators. And so first of all, we want to make sure that we instantiate an indicator for the capacity of our missile launcher. So we'll say that while that missile ammo child count, so that's the number of children that transform has, is less than the missile launcher's missile capacity, we want to instantiate a missile display prefab and parent it to that missile ammo transform. Now we want to enable or disable those indicators based on the number of missiles we have left to shoot in that launcher. So for int m equals 0, m is less than missile ammo sub I dot child count increment m. So what we're going to do in here is say missile ammo sub I. So for each of those, we're going to get the child at position M. So we're going through the number of indicators we have. We're getting each one at a time. We're going to grab their game object. We're going to set it active if this index that we're on is less than the missile launcher's missiles. There, that should take care of that. Now in on reload completed, we're going to also update our missile display. That way, if we were out of missiles and now we're reloaded our missiles, we'll display the full complement of missiles up there. And we're going to update the text for the reloads remaining, because now we should have one less reload. And we're going to use string interpolation. We're going to say reloads, missile launchers. We're just going to use the first one, even though we have two launchers. And we're going to set that to reloads. Okay, let's go back into Unity. There's a couple of things I want to do. One thing I want to do is I want to go into our project settings and the script execution order, and I want to add missile launcher before the MissileUI, because I want to make sure that the missile launcher's enable method gets called before we set values in the UI. Because if you remember in the missile launcher, we're initializing the missiles remaining, the reloads remaining, and all this stuff in on enable. And I just want to make sure that, you know, if we call this update missile display before those values are initialized, it's going to think we don't have any missiles, and these are all going to be deactivated. And our reloads remaining is going to have the incorrect value. And they won't change until we fire a missile or do something to trigger the event to get these to update. So I just want to make sure that the missile launcher scripts execute before the MissileUI scripts. The other thing we need to do is we need to add these scripts. So if we go to our player ship, this is who's going to actually handle that UI. So we'll take our MissileUI and drag it there. We need to populate all these guys. I'm going to right click on our player ship, select properties, so we can keep these things active. We're going to take both of our missile launchers and drag them to here. So now we got both of them. And then we're going to go into this guy. We need to create a prefab for this. I'm going to rename this MissileIndicator. And I'm going to delete these. And then we're going to go into our prefabs UI. And I'm going to drag this into there. And then I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to delete all 4 of them. Okay, because we're going to programmatically add them. So in here, where it says missile ammo, we want to drag that. Actually, let me rename these. I'm going to call this missile ammo left. And missile ammo right. And then I'll select both of these and I will drag them into here. Cool. So for missile display prefab, we drag in our missile indicator. For reloaded display, we don't currently have one. Or a reloading bar, so we'll leave them empty for now. Reloads remaining, we will drag in that. Okay. And we'll go ahead and give this a test, and if we did everything right, we should see our missiles displayed in the lower left-hand corner, our reloads. We'll go ahead and fire some missiles, and you can see them, they disappear from the number of missiles. And here's our last 2. And they are gone. And then it says reloads 2. And after 10 seconds, we should see our missiles reappear. And then reloads should be 1. And there they are. So we have 4 more missiles in each launcher. We'll go ahead and launch all those. Circle around and get them. Boom! Okay, fire these last 2. Blow up an asteroid. Nice waste, some perfect good missiles. Now we've got 8 more missiles. So I don't think we reset our reload time because they reloaded immediately, it looks like. We have no reloads left. So if we go ahead and fire all these, we shouldn't get any more missiles. Let's wait. Wait. And it looks like that is working. Oh, I also noticed our asteroids are not rotating. I know I applied rotation to them, and I think the problem is we need to get rid of the angular drag. Let me just give that a test. We should see some rotation on the asteroids. Not much, but there is some rotation. So I might want to look at where I'm applying the rotation and add more than what I'm adding. Something to add to the to-do list. First, I want to see what's up with our reload time on the missiles. So to fix that, we'll go into our missile launcher script and go down to where we reload. And this is the problem. I meant to put fire delay, and I accidentally typed reload delay. Okay, I'm sure that will fix the problem. The next thing we want to add is we want to display our reloading status. So up here in our UI manager, we've got our MissileUI. We got our missiles loadout. We want to add another empty game object, and we're going to call this reloading. And underneath of that, we're going to want reloading text. So UI TextMeshPro, and I'm going to call this reloading text. And this will use the new Orbitron font. And this is going to say reloading. And we want this to be lower bottom. And grab that. We're also going to want to make it centered and not wrapped, and change the font size to 24. Trying to think about roughly where do I want it, because I'm going to be displaying it over top of where the missiles would normally be displayed. I think something like that's probably good enough for now. We're also going to want to do a sort of a progress bar. So we're going to have a UI image, and we're going to use the health bar as our source image. And I want to make this kind of a dark blue, or something kind of like that. And I'm going to call this background. And I want to make this something like 150 by 25. And the image type, simple, should be fine. And then we'll duplicate that, but I'm going to use a lighter blue. Maybe something like that. And we're going to call this foreground. But the image type is going to be filled horizontal from the left. So that gives us a nice progress bar type thingy. And we're going to want to move that down. I'm going to move them both down. I'm going to hold down the Alt key. I think something like that would look good. Now if we go down into our missile display, this is our whole reloading display that will turn on and off. And then this is our reload bar that we're going to use to set the fill amount on. So let's go edit that script. Get rid of this unused using statement. And I'm going to add a new method here. I'm going to do LateUpdate. And in this case, I think I am going to poll the missile launcher and not rely on events. So I'm going to say, if not, missile launchers. I'm just going to look at the first one. So if it's not reloading, and we have not activated that reloading display, I'm just going to return. So I don't need to do anything. Otherwise, I want to deactivate that and return. So that'll take care of the situation of where we don't want to display that. Now, we want to, otherwise, we do want to display it. We want to set its fill amount. Isn't that an image? Oh, I want to look at the reloading bar. I want the reloading bar dot fill amount. I'm actually going to do a math.lerp. I'm going to go from its current fill amount I'm going to go to the missile launcher's reload percent. I'm going to do 10 times time.delta time. Make that a float. That should smoothly lerp our fill amount for the reloading, and then we want to make sure we display it. So if it's not currently displayed, then we'll set it active true. Let's jump back into Unity. Okay, let's launch our missiles. I'm channeling buckwheat there for a second. All right, reloading. Boom! Nice. The only thing I want to do is I want to initialize the fill amount to 0. I can actually do that in code. I noticed that it kind of animated down to 0, which is not really what we want. I want to do that in here. All right, let's just give that one more quick test, see how that looks. Reloading, that looked good. Okay. So now I want to do a similar thing for the blasters. So I'm going to create a new empty game object. I'm going to call this BlasterUI. And I'm going to create underneath of that another empty game object, which I'm going to call capacitors. And that's going to have a vertical layout group. And underneath of that, we're going to have something called a capacitor level. So that's going to be an empty game object. And I'm going to put 3 images under there. So first I'm going to say UI image, and we're going to use the health bar image. And I want this one to be kind of a dark gray. Something kind of like that. And I'm going to call that background. And I'm going to go ahead and set that to be filled horizontal from the left. And I want this to be narrower. So 150 by 10. Something like that. And then I'm going to duplicate that. And I'm going to call this one foreground. And we're going to give that a nice bright red color. And then I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to duplicate that. And I'm going to call this cooldown. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an image that's going to kind of mask the other two. I'm going to make it a nice dark color, but it's going to be somewhat transparent. So looking at that, I think I want to make it a little bit less transparent than that. Something kind of like that. And this is going to fill differently. It's going to fill from the right. Like that. So as you're cooling down, every time you shoot and you have a cooldown, it's going to real quickly go to there and then like that. And then as you deplete your capacitor, this will be going down, 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 down. But every time you shoot, you'll have this cooldown. Something like that. So that means they're going to have to add a new parameter to the blaster. I'm going to implement a capacitor to it. So initially you'll have a certain amount of energy in the blaster, in their capacitor. And every time you shoot, every shot will have some shot cost in terms of energy that it's going to have to take from the capacitor. And then when the capacitor is depleted, you're only going to be able to fire like a minimal projectile from the blaster, it's going to do a minimal amount of damage. I'm kind of thinking like along the lines of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, where spellcasters have spell slots, but even when they're out of spell slots, they can cast cantrips, which are basically weaker spells. So they could do something like Ray of Frost. It's a cantrip. It does a little bit of damage, but at least they're not totally out of the fight. They can still do something offensive even when they're out of spell slots. I want to kind of do the same thing with the blasters. And so the blasters will have a capacitor that you can deplete and it will recharge over time. But even when you're out of capacitance, out of energy in the capacitor, you'll still be able to fire, but it won't do as much damage as if you had a full charge to shoot. So hopefully that makes sense. And I think it'll look pretty cool on the display too. So I know I kind of rambled a lot there. I'm going to add a text field here. I'm just going to call this heading. And that's going to say, oops, blasters. And we're going to use our Orbitron font size 24. And let me just position this a little bit. Actually, do I want to use the rect transform? I want to center this bottom center. And I think I want to do the same thing with all these guys. So then I'll grab this text. I want to go down here and I want to say centered horizontally, vertically, no wrapping. So let me go drag that back again. I think something kind of like that. And then we'll take this whole thing. I think that looks kind of cool down there. Maybe I think I can live with that there. All right, let's go script this puppy. So let's make the changes to the blaster first. So we're going to want to add some things here. We're going to want some new floats here. Capacitor, max capacitor, cost per shot, and recharge rate. And those will be initialized in our init method here. I'm going to reformat this stuff a little bit just so I can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to add max capacitor. I'm going to give these all default values so I don't have to change where I'm calling it from. We'll start with 1,000 energy for that. That needs to be a float. Actually, that should be an int. I'll make it a float. No, that should be an int. I can't make up my mind. So max capacitor, cost per shot, we'll say 50. And then the recharge rate, we'll make that a float. I think I do want these to be floats just for the recharging and stuff. So recharge rate, and we'll say you recharge 20 units per second. So down in here, we need to initialize all these guys. So we have our max, we'll say our capacitor equals our max capacitor, which equals max capacitor. We're going to want our cost per shot to equal cost per shot. And we're going to want our recharge rate to equal our recharge rate. All right, so when we fire a projectile, we're actually going to want to know whether or not we're firing a full charge or not. So we can adjust the amount of damage. And that would basically be true if our capacitor amount is greater than or equal to the cost per shot. Otherwise, we're firing like a half charge. And I'm going to create a new prefab so we have a different projectile based on whether or not we're firing a full shot, just so there's something visual to tell the player, hey, you're firing a weaker shot. But for now, I'm going to leave that as it is. And the only thing I'm going to change in here is under damage. We'll say full charge damage, otherwise damage times maybe 10%. I think that'll work. And I need to convert that to an integer. All right. We also want to make sure that we reduce our capacitor. So we're going to say our capacitor will be equal to whatever's greater. Actually, we'll go ahead and clamp it. So it's going to be capacitor minus cost per shot, 0 or max, or capacitor, what is it? No, I think I was right the first time. I'm going to do a max. We just don't want it to go below 0. So we're going to subtract the cost per shot from our capacitor level. But if we go below 0, we want to stay at 0. I think that all looks good. We want to regenerate in the update method, though. So what we can do in here is we can say capacitor equals map.min max capacitor, or capacitor plus the recharge rate times time.delta time. So we'll add our recharge rate adjusted by time.delta time, but we won't go any higher than our max capacitor. And then we want to publicly expose some of these new variables here. So let's have a public float. I'm going to call this capacitor charge percentage. And that'll just be capacitor divided by max capacitor. And then our cooldown percentage. And this I do want to clamp. So it's going to be cooldown divided by cooldown time, clamp to 0 and 1. All right, that should work. Go back into Unity. We're going to want to create our BlasterUI script. So under scripts UI, create a new C# script. BlasterUI, and this is going to be a fairly simple script. We'll add the Unity Engine.UI using namespace. A couple of serialized fields. We're going to want our array of blasters. We're going to want those blaster bars. And the cooldown bars. And those will be an array of images. Okay. And one function, LateUpdate. So in here, we're going to iterate through our blasters. And we're just going to say that the blaster's fill amount, blaster bars fill amount It's going to be mathf.lerp. We're going to go from their current fill amount to the blaster's capacitor charge percentage, and we'll go at a rate of 10 times time.delta time. And we want to do the same thing for our cooldown bars. Pretty that up a little bit. I think that should do it for the scripting. Go back into Unity. We're going to drag that BlasterUI script onto the player ship. Let's right click on our player ship, properties. And so for our blasters, we will select both of them. For our blaster bars, so I think we're going to want 2 of these. So blaster bars will go from foreground, and then cooldown bars, cooldown. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing both bars down here. Oh, the spacing. So we need to go into our vertical layout group. Really reduce our spacing. We don't want any padding. I think that looks pretty good. Let's just hit play and see what happens. Our capacitor is going down. You see the cooldown mask briefly get applied. You don't really see it on the bottom end though, and you can see the capacitor recharging. The next thing will be to create a different prefab for the blaster projectile when our capacitor is so empty that we're only doing a minimal shot. So let's go into our prefabs, weapons. We got our player projectile. Let's duplicate that. And we will call that weak player projectile. Now, one thing is we're using a material that we created for our projectile, for the capsule, called player projectile. So we go into our materials. Player projectile. I want to duplicate that. And again, rename it to weak player projectile. And one thing I want to do is make it a little bit darker and reduce the alpha a little bit. And then I want to reduce the emission on it. Actually, maybe I'll turn off the emission altogether. Okay. And on this point light, I'm going to reduce the intensity and the range a little bit. And make this a little bit darker as well. Maybe a little less saturated. And what else do I want to change in there? The trail renderer. Maybe make this a little bit less of a trail. And for this color, make this a little less saturated, a little darker. Same for over here. Oops, didn't mean to add an extra point. Stop that. Okay, I think that should be enough to make it look different enough to give the player some kind of clue. Oh, that also means we need to go into that Blaster script again. And we want to add another prefab to it. So we've got our projectile here. We want weak projectile prefab. And then down here, we can do full charge, projectile prefab, weak projectile prefab. All right, go back into Unity. And we can also, when we get to adding sound effects, play a different sound effect too, just to give them another clue. So we still have capacitor. We're firing the full strength ones. We're draining our capacitor. Huh. Oh, I never assigned the prefab. That is null. So we need to go into our prefab weapon, weak player projectile. Let's try that again. And now we are firing the weak projectiles, and I can't really tell the difference. Let's see if we can't make that a little more... Oh, you know what? I never changed the material. So in our capsule here, we want to pick the weak player projectile material. Yeah, and it gets darker and it's subtle, but at least there's some indication that it's not a full charge. I think next I'm going to start adding some sound effects for the blasters and the missiles launching. Well, that wraps things up for this video. We got some good progress done on the UI. We now show the number of missiles that we have remaining with a cool sprite. We have a reloading indicator, which gives the user some visual feedback to let them know when things are being reloaded. We added a capacitor to our blasters, which I think is an interesting component to the game, which can maybe add some tactical options for the player if they want to consider whether to fire their blasters or save them for a better shot. So if you have any questions about anything I covered in this video or any suggestions about things you'd like to see in the future, drop a comment and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. And if you found this video useful, do me a favor, click that like and subscribe button. It really does help me to grow my channel. And finally, if you want to be notified when I post my next video, where I'll be adding music and sound effects, click that notification bell. Well, I really appreciate you tuning in, so thanks so much for watching, and good luck on your game development journey.